twice yearly newsletter, and by checking out some of the information we have online. And I'll tell you more about that later on. You can also contribute to the scholarship fund by donating to us. And again, I'll give you the details about how to do that a little bit later on. So today we're really pleased to have Jimena Márquez speaking for us. Jimena is a Mexican citizen currently living in Montreal, where she also teaches college. She's an anthropologist who has visited Huichol territory many times, both to learn from them and to conduct some of the research that she's done. Jimena is currently finishing a PhD focused on Indigenous education, and she has experience working with the Mohawks and the Inuit of northern Quebec. So Jimena is going to speak to us for about 40 minutes, after which there'll be lots of time for questions and discussion and so on. So you may want to grab a pen and keep track of whatever your questions are while Jimena is speaking. And after Jimena's spoken, I'll give you the detailed information that I promised a few minutes ago by way of email addresses and so on. And I just want to close by thanking Jimena for taking the time to speak to us today and for being so enthusiastic about the work that we're doing with the Huichol Scholarship Fund. Jimena has volunteered to assist Diana and I and others to do the work that is necessary to keep the fund going and growing and so on. And so we're really grateful for that. So I want to turn the floor over to Jimena.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Diana. Also, I mean, for me, it's a really great pleasure to be here with you and to share a little bit of that enthusiasm that I have for this fund and for the Huichol people and for the Huichol culture. So I do have a presentation with some pictures that I want to show you as I kind of take you along this introduction. And I'll be speaking a little bit in general terms and then more specifically about my own field of interest and then to my current research, which is connected to the scholarship fund. So I will share my screen. Okay, so share. There we go. Okay, so you're seeing, right, the main picture. So the first thing that I wanted to start, as this is an introduction, I wanted to speak a little bit about the Huichol from very general to more specific, right? So the first thing that we want to talk about is who the Huichol are kind of in the grand picture of Mexico. So Mexico currently about 126 million people. Some of the figures that I found was that from these, we have about 14% that identify as Indigenous. But then the census more specifically identifies also those that speak Indigenous languages. So Mexico is a country of diverse Indigenous cultures, and there are about 68 Indigenous languages spoken. Chiapas and Oaxaca are the states where you have the greatest number of Indigenous speakers. So among these speakers, Indigenous speakers, the Huichol are associated with the Uto-Aztec language. So there's a different groups, the Tepehuanos, the Coras, that speak some of these from these family languages. And there are about 30,000 within the traditional territory that I'll show you in a minute, and estimated about 43,000. Now, these are not such specific numbers because conducting census in these regions for many reasons is always complicated. So let's keep in mind that these are estimates. So this gives you a little bit of a sense And just to give you another parallel, if we look at the Arctic and all of the Inuit people in the Arctic, they're about 35,000. So just to keep some numbers in mind, I'd like to compare. So in terms of the territory, this is a map of the Huichol territory that spreads across 4 states, right? So the main state is Jalisco, where some of you might be in Puerto Vallarta. And then we have Nayarit, where you have the main city of Tepic. And then you see little bits of Zacatecas and little bits of Durango. Now, the Huichol territory existed before these maps were drawn, right? Huichol homeland actually was much bigger. So this is what is still remains. But obviously, we have Huichol people living outside of this territory in the bigger cities like Guadalajara, like Tepic, and even like Mexico City. So we identify a homeland, and then there's the different places where which they identify also as pertaining to Huichol cosmology and mythology. Some places on the coast, some places in the desert, right? So there's a physical homeland, and there's a whole also mythological homeland. If we look very specifically at what this region looked like, you have all these different towns. So San Andres is here. This is the town that I visited. And when you see a little airplane, that's not an airport, right? It's just a strip where you kind of land a little plane on top of a mesa. So if you're lucky, you land there. And then, I mean, this territory was traditionally very hard of access. Now a lot of roads have been built in, but it used to be all dirt roads. So quite hard of access. And as soon as you leave this, for example, Jesus Maria is already Cora territory. So that's already another indigenous population. So just to give you a sense of all these different localities. So I wanted to kind of point out some of the history that I was interested in when I was doing my research, which was a lot about cultural resistance, because one of the things that really moved me and that I identified with the Huichol was their sense of cultural pride. I remember going, just as an anecdote, to San Andres, and somebody telling me, a Huichol that I was speaking to, saying, you know, all you people come and visit us, and you have material wealth, you know, you have TVs and you have big houses. And said, we have spiritual wealth. We've always been very proud of our culture, of our heritage. And we've always kind of been very strong in defending it. And when I look a little bit at the history of this peoples, I see that. So we can look at it even from their history of colonization, right? So when the Spanish arrive, they conquer Mexico City, right? Around 1520, 21. And right away, they're trying to conquer and expand all over Mexico, which is a big country and it's a big empire. And they go to the north, and the Chichimec are like the savages to the north, which even the Aztec tried to conquer. So they engage in these wars. And then as after the peace, so-called, has been established, they start to found these missions and these towns, which actually circumvent all that area that you saw on the map. And they actually form almost like and these mission towns are often fortified, so they look a lot like forts. So that region, that mountainous region, becomes like a refuge region, right? So you have a lot of these different indigenous groups, not just the Huichol, that went and fled to the mountains, right? Because these mountains were hard of access. They knew the caves, they knew where to hide. The army was not necessarily that interested in going there. But finally, 200 years after the conquest, they decide that enough is enough, you know, we should really get in there and, you know, show them who's the boss. And the army gets there and they really start to try to colonize that and evangelize more aggressively. And the dates that we see is that around 1850 is that the missionaries had said, okay, we have succeeded. You know, we have built these churches, we have destroyed some of the Huichol temples. And actually, there was always still that spirit of resistance, right? So we have a great rebellion in 1856, and there's a period of independence from the colonizers, where they rebuild their communities, their temples. Some of these churches are burned, and they consolidate those communities. So I didn't go into the 19th century and the revolution, and because I was really interested in this first period of colonization, because it was very aggressive in Mexico, especially religiously, right? The Spanish were really trying to impose Catholicism very strongly across the territory that they had colonized. And you have to remember, they went all the way to New Mexico, to Santa Fe. I mean, they really went very high up north. So I wanted to introduce a little bit this religion, this cosmology, which is considered so pre-Hispanic, so predating Catholicism. And basically, what we call a Huichol temple is what you see in this picture. It's a caligüey or tuquipa, which is often at the center of the ceremonial of the town, not a town, of the village. These are ceremonial centers, and they are led by the ceremonies and the rituals are led by shamans, or the maracame. And they worship the deities that actually they consider to be their ancestors, right? So in the mythology and the creation myths of the Huichol, these deities, this pantheon of deities, are directly associated as the first beings that existed, and so that they descend from them. So they actually talk to them or refer to them in kinship terms. And I'm going to explain a little bit more. So from our perspective, we would say, well, you know, they worship nature, right? So there's the sun god, there's the fire god, the deer, the peyote deer, the rains, the earth, the winds, and all of these varied aspects of nature. And these are not just worshipped in a temple, but there's actually visiting to the places associated with the birth of these beings in the land, right? So a lot of indigenous cosmologies are very land-based, right? So when we say they're land-based, is that the topography of a place is filled with the sacred spaces where these beings are said to emerge. So there's a specific place where the fire was born, and there's a specific place that you can visit to visit the ocean deity and the water. And so all these places come alive and are considered sacred. And so you visit these places in pilgrimage, in annual pilgrimage at certain moments of the year. And it's a ritual cycle. And the Huichol have a very complex and intrinsic ritual cycle that they have maintained, because, and this is one of the things that is amazing, is that as agricultural peoples, because they do plant corn, the whole cycle of the plant is respected. And then there's different places to visit at different times. One of the most famous ones is the pilgrimage to Wirikuta, or to find the peyote, right? This is, a lot of people have heard about the Huichol through the peyote, through the pilgrimage to the desert, right? So this is part of this intrinsic calendar. And I wanted to show you some images of this cosmology, because that is where the art comes in, right? So the yarn paintings that we find that the Huichol makes so beautifully depict a lot of this cosmology. So I found a couple of examples on the internet, because they're very famous for their art, as you know. So for example, the sun deity, right? Nuestro Padre, our Father, the Sun. So in this yarn painting, you see the sun deity depicted at the center, but it's connected to everything else, right? You have the peyotes around the sun, you have the shamans at the corners of the yarn painting, and the stick that they have with their feathers is called the murieri, right? So the shaman, when he does the rituals, when he connects to these deities, he often uses the murieri, and it's the same thing that he has on his hat. And you see that he's doing offerings. He has some candles, he has some gourds, and you have the deer and the corn. So all of these are connected. The grandfather, the fire. So the fire is a very important deity. A lot of a lot of the myths are like the story of this complete darkness, right? And where does the first light come from, right? So we have the importance of the fire. And again, you see, oh, there's a typo. So it's grandfather fire. Sorry about that. These effective kinship terms for father, grandfather. So there's a sense of filiation, a very strong sense of filiation. And again, you know, in these yarn paintings, you see other symbols. So the father, the grandfather is connected to the sun, right? So they're in the center of the yarn painting. But if you see, you have these snakes. So the snakes are going to be associated with other deities, especially the feminine deities, but also the night, the waters, the caves. This is the deer, cola de venado or Tatutsi maxaquauqui. So there's different deers. I'm not sure I was able to find exactly the correct yarn painting, but the deer is a very central figure in Huichol cosmology. And there are actually two deer. So this is the one that's the great grandfather. And then there's the brother deer. So the brother deer, which is Tamatsi Parietzika, or sometimes also Kauyumari, this is the deity that is really the most associated with the shaman, because this is supposed to be the big brother, the messenger, the helper, the friend. And you often see him associated with the peyote because it's the deer peyote deity. So it's really interesting how these different elements usually are not exclusive, but a lot of the Huichol deities sometimes have combined elements, which makes it very rich. And when we look at the deer also image, you see the peyote is part of him. And actually, when the Huichol go on the pilgrimage to the desert, they say they hunt the peyote like they would hunt the deer. And it's the footprints of the deer, of the god deer in the desert where you find the peyote. So the shaman really approaches the peyote hunt like a deer hunt. So it's paradoxical because you mean, okay, they're going to kill their god because they're going to hunt a deer. And that's one of the elements of a lot of actually indigenous cosmologies, is that there's central animals that are the livelihood and that are very sacred. And yet, yes, you do kill them, but there's a sense of that they sacrifice themselves for you and you offer them back something in sacrifice. So there's always this reciprocity going on, this giving back and receiving, this relationship, of reciprocity that gets established with all the elements, right? So and often which will give very intricate offerings. They offer to the springs, they'll offer to the desert, they'll offer to caves, and they will offer to the peyote. And in some of these yarn paintings, you see always kind of these offerings with the feathers and with the different arrows and with the candles. And I wanted to show you one image of a female deity, which is Takutsi, which is our grandmother. And this is interesting because even though she's depicted as an old woman, she's the goddess of fertility. She has been there from the beginning of time, and she's shown as giving birth, so fertility, growth, and also she's associated with the night and the night creatures. So that's why you have the different the serpents that are associated with snakes. So it's interesting because you also have this duality going on between the night and the day. So you have the night deities and the day deities. So it's a very complex pantheon of relationships and of maintaining that cosmic balance between night and day, between order and chaos. So that just gives you a little bit of, and I just want to point out that, you know, none of these have Christian symbols, right? We didn't see any crosses or any angels or any of that sort of iconography, which is actually, you know, I think quite exceptional when you consider when Catholicism started to arrive, right, in Mexico. So that's kind of an introduction. So how did I get interested in this, or how did I get involved in this? So I'll talk a little bit more about my research. So I first visited San Andres Tateque for Easter, right? Semana Santa is a big thing in Mexico. We have 2 weeks off, and a lot of people go, to Puerto Vallarta, to the beaches to enjoy the sun and the weather. And my mother actually had a friend that had a long-term relationship with San Andres. Her name is Rocío Echevarría. She's a nurse, and she lived there for many years. And she had invited my mother, who was her friend. And so she said, okay, let's go. I was just a kid, and a kid living in a big city like Mexico City, very urban setting, very westernized. So to suddenly get in a van, in a truck, and go and do 2 days of road and enter deep into this territory was really amazing. It was a discovery like of a parallel dimension, because basically you can live in Mexico and all your life without ever going to one of these communities, especially these remote communities. So I was really blown away. I was fascinated by what I saw. Semana Santa is a very lively ritual. It's happening, right? There's a lot of music, there's dancing, there's chants, there's festivities, there's a feast. It seems like so rich. I later returned on my own as a teenager and as a young adult every year that I had a chance to go, because it was Semana Santa, and I just couldn't think of anything better to do than to go to San Andres. And then I was actually studying religious studies here in Canada at McGill, and I realized that, well, religious studies, you learn a lot about cosmology. Usually it's traditions that have written down their cosmology. So I realized that it was actually anthropology that would lead me to learn more about Indigenous peoples and oral traditions, which is like the Huichol tradition. So I decided to kind of move out of religious studies and into anthropology, into cultural anthropology, and to study specifically shamanism and also syncretism and the Huichol religion specifically. So while I was doing my master's degree, I went back to San Andres, and which was great because I already knew I had been able to establish some relationships there through Rocio, but also through my own traveling. So I was able to stay with some families before and after Easter, and also come back, because at Easter they were very, very busy. So it was not the best time to ask questions. It was more time to observe and participate in what I could. And especially, pay attention to a lot of things and write down some questions, so that when I would return after Semana Santa, I could ask my questions. So when I graduated from my master's degree, I started teaching anthropology and Indigenous studies here in college in Canada at John Abbott College. And unfortunately, I had no longer any vacations for Easter, because Easter in Canada is Good Friday and Easter Monday. That's it. And when you're a teacher, it's hard to get away for 2 weeks, especially when the semester ends in May. So that was a major limitation for my trips, unfortunately, for going back in Semana Santa. So I've been teaching in this field for the last 10 years. And then I got involved with a number of projects that were more specific to Indigenous education in Canada. And so I started doing my PhD in 2018. I took a leave from teaching. And so I've been doing my PhD since 2018, and I'm going to finish it this year. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of my own personal history with the Huichol. So my own research was focused on a very specific santito, which is called like a Christ figure, which was called the Aparruki Christ. And this picture was taken by the son of Rocio. His name is Kalman Mueller. He actually lives in the Bay Area. He's a great photographer. And so as you see, this is actually a small crucifix that was part of, this crucifix was originally in the town of Tensompa, which is one of the towns which is marginal to the Huichol territory. And it was modified by the Huichol themselves. So the cross was taken away and it was placed on the head of a deer, right, with the feathers. So for me, this was fascinating how basically you could take a crucifix and indigenize it and transform it. And it's not just the iconography.
So I signed up for a, oh, sorry.
The iconography reflects also the meaning, the change of meaning of this icon, of this figure. So and that actually is found also in Semana Santa, right? So the ritual of Semana Santa also has been indigenized in the sense that it's not just about, okay, Christ died on the cross and resurrected 3 days later. There's actually, it's rewritten from the perspective of Huichol cosmology. So you really have a battle between the forces of light and darkness. And so the Christ figure is now associated with the sun, right? So there's a, and he's not said to have died and resurrected. He's asleep. So the ritual that actually goes from Wednesday to Saturday, there's days where you're not supposed to make any noise, you're not supposed to sing or dance, or kids are not supposed to play outside. The whole town participates in this ritual. And there's different things that you're allowed to do and not allowed to do, and there's processions and there's dances and there's different rituals. And the climax are animal sacrifices, which again is not very Catholic, right? And here we have again this really very strong importance of this Mesoamerican pre-Hispanic ritual, which is the importance of blood, right? So blood is the most sacred substance, and especially the blood of an animal that has been offered in sacrifice to the deities, to the Christ figures, or to any deity. That blood is then used to bless everything, and it is considered very sacred. And it's interesting because this is a ritual that probably was hidden for a certain amount of years because it was so frowned upon, and actually it has gained importance. This has become actually bigger and bigger, and it also proves to their cultural, right, resistance, because this is really very much part of this pre-Hispanic cosmology. And again, these rituals are not guided by priests. I mean, I remember one year going and there was a priest from a mission nearby that it was just kind of standing around and looking at all this, and he actually had nothing to do or nothing to say. He was like, okay. And he could actually not voice any discontent. The rituals were led by shamans, and the chants and the processions, everything was led by shamans that were in charge of the Christ figures. So they have what is called a cargo, which is a responsibility for 5 years to take care of the rituals associated with some of these Christ figures. And again, it's Easter, but for the priest, it's not the same Easter. So I always thought that was really interesting. So I'm going to show you some pictures that I found. I was not personally allowed to take pictures when I was there. You have to ask permission. But I found a photographer that did get permission to publish them in Mexico Desconocido. So here, this is an image of, so this is the shaman, the Maracame, and you see in his bowl, he has like a plastic bowl with some blood, right, that he's using to anoint. So this is one of the Christ figures, and he's covered up, right? He's dressed. He's still sleeping, and then that will be taken off at some point during the ritual. And what he's using is his murieri, which is, these are with the feathers. These sticks are considered really the healing tools and the ritual tools of the shamans. And wherever you see the men that have these hats with the feathers, usually signals that they are the shamans, and they have, you see in their bags, they have a lot of offerings, a lot of the candles. I'm trying to, okay, and this is in the streets of San Andres. So part of the ritual one day is to do a Via Crucis, right? So they take out all the Cristos, and you go around the whole village, kind of this procession. And the kids here find it very funny. And it's a big, like, it's a big deal, right? It really takes the whole day. And it's a town that actually is not that populated, but for Easter, a lot of the ranchos, a lot of the smaller communities come together for the celebration. So these are some of the animals that are going to be sacrificed or were just sacrificed. I'm not sure. So, I mean, it's interesting because we sometimes, we associate maybe animal sacrifice with cruelty or, with something painful. But I think these animals, first of all, are chanted to all night. They are treated the best possible way before they are sacrificed. They're really considered very highly. And then this is the feast for the village, right? So the blood is offered, but then everything is butchered and cooked within hours, and it becomes a grand feast for the whole village. So for me, witnessing this over the years, it was also a lesson of community work, of community gathering, of really celebrating this occasion as a whole community. Now, another thing that's interesting that happened when I was there is that you had a group of Aztec dancers that at the end of the week wanted to dance for this aparruki, right? And so they asked permission once Easter was finished, if they could dance at the central plaza. So then the Huichol were themselves kind of seeing this ritual, which is inspired by the Aztec dances. So they actually found it very funny. Some of them are laughing because this is not how they wear feathers, or this is not how they usually clothe. And this was part of my research because it was kind of paradoxical that you had Mexican dancers inspired by an Aztec dance coming to this indigenous community and dancing in a plaza in the middle of which there's a cross.
I didn't realize that.
So that's, and here it's at the end of the dance, and they do these chants in Nahuatl and in Spanish. It was an interesting exchange, actually, because it was as if they were also trying to offer back to the Huichol community one of their rituals, which was an interesting meeting point for Easter, right? So they were coming and participating throughout this week and seeing all the Huichol rituals. And at the end, they asked permission, can we offer this dance to you? This is our dance. And it was an interesting exchange, and it was a good exchange. They received it generously, and they appreciated it. So it was, and this happened on numerous years. It became kind of a tradition. So the danzantes are coming and they're gonna dance. And sometimes there were just 5 and sometimes there were 25. So it became of a tradition. So in my own current interests, I went from Indigenous cosmologies to Indigenous education just because of the field that I'm in, right? So what I saw is that Indigenous youth are kind of in the middle of 2 worlds, right? They do want to maintain a link to these ancestral cultures, very strong, very anchored in the land. But at the same time, they want to participate, or they're a part of a modern Western American culture. So how they do both, right? And that's, I think, this is a question that is true for the Huichol, but it's true for, Mohawk youth, Inuit youth. And this is where, when Brian talked to me about the Huichol Scholarship Fund, I thought, of course, this is a lot what I also see in Canada, and I could see how it was true for the Huichol. Yes, the traditional roles are there. You know, some will be shamans and some will be leaders in their communities, but a lot of them are saying, you know, why don't I get actually modern education or Western education and use those tools, and I reinvest them in my community and use them again to maintain, you know, to support traditional governance, to support cultural resistance, sovereignty in the territories. They face so many challenges. It's economical, political, territorial. So obviously, these young people want to be part of their communities, but they might not be part in the same way as their fathers or grandfathers. And I thought that was really interesting to be supporting these young people. And I didn't know it was happening. And that's why I got so excited, because I've been dealing more with Indigenous youth in Canada. And I hear that, you know, I want to study nursing, or I want to be a teacher, and then I want to go back to my community because I see what my community needs. You know, I've heard these young people in college saying, that's why I want to get an education, because, you know, we need more psychologists in my community. We have issues with mental health, or we have issues with nutrition. And so if I get those degrees, I can enrich in my community, right? So for me, it's been much more with dealing with Indigenous youth. And I've been very excited to meet some of the Huichol Scholarship Fund recipients through the cafecitos, our monthly or every 6 weeks meeting. And I do hear some of those similarities that I hear in Canada. They're a bit older, the Huichol students that I have met. They're very mature, and they're very much aware also about kind of this position that they have, trying to maintain a connection to their roots, while at the same time getting tools, modern tools to kind of reinvest in their communities, but as who they are today, right? Not necessarily as their ancestors. How am I doing with time, Brian?
You're doing just fine.
Yeah, I mean, that's that I didn't want to kind of, I think I'm good with that. If you have questions, comments, I'd love to hear you. I haven't seen many of you. I've seen Yvonne.
Well, maybe as people are formulating their questions, I can just remind them, first of all, that if you're not already on the Huichol Scholarship Fund mailing list, you can put yourself on that, and I'll give you an email address. Apologies for the fact that I don't have it written down. I'll put it in the chat in a few minutes, but it is my email address, and my name is Brian, Brian, McDougall, McDougall 25 at gmail.com. And again, I'll put it in the chat. Secondly, oh, thank you, Diana. She's already put it there. And secondly, if you want to support the work that we're doing in the Huichol Scholarship Fund financially, we would encourage you to visit the website of the Wixarika Research Center. And Huichol is spelled Wixarika. The Huichol Research Center website, it has a donations page. You can make a donation there and specify when doing so that is for the Huichol Scholarship Fund. And just finally, before we open it up for questions, I want to mention that we have 2 additional Zoom meetings planned for the next little while, one in February and another in March. In February, Manuel Lopez Delgado, who is an Indigenous Mexican university professor, will be talking to us about some of the problems that Indigenous people face when they attend university. in Mexico. And then later in March, we will have a couple of the current Huichol Scholarship Fund students talking about their experience. And also Diana and I will be taking any and all questions about the state of the Huichol Scholarship Fund and our plans for the immediate future. So we don't have times and dates for those meetings yet, but you will get an email in the not too distant future, at least about the next meeting. So with that, I'll turn it over for questions and comments.
Well, there's one comment or question on from Gaya Dowens. If Wixarika communities have their own schools, well, they have primary schools. I think there are some secondary schools, but obviously post-secondary, no. So that's the reality of many indigenous peoples across North America and Mexico. So you have usually local primary schools, but as soon as kids want to get more education, they have to leave their communities. And sometimes they have to leave very far. So that's part of the culture shock of leaving your community and coming to big cities to pursue a higher education. I'm not sure where the secondary schools or the high schools are in the Wixarika territory, but definitely not each community has one, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And there's another question by Clemente Guzman. It says, are you going to show some of the yarn art? Is that for me or for, I'm not sure for who the Clemente, if you want to ask more specifically. You can turn on your mic.
Let's see, I'll turn it on for him.
Okay.
Oh, no, it turned off again.
Let me try again. Is that
There.
on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, because I saw a picture of the yarn art. I thought they were going to show some artwork of that. So that's
Well,
why I
I-
jumped in. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
okay. No, I showed some of the yarn art because when I was talking about some of the deities, I wanted to show how they get illustrated through the yarn painting. So I was using, was not
Okay.
talking about the yarn art per
I'm
se.
sorry.
I was explaining how the yarn art actually depicts some of this cosmology.
Okay.
Can I add a couple just to take advantage of this? I think this is so phenomenal. Jimena, what a great historical overview. And I think it's so wonderful how you brought in the Apajuki and San Andres and Semana Santa, which is a big deal. And I think it shows the complexity and the diversity, because what you see in San Andres, you actually might not see in necessarily the same way in another community. So just thank you so much. Clemente, you can visit also the Huichol Research Center's website.
Okay.
One of our biggest specialties is yarn painting. So one of our
Okay.
founders, Juan and Yvonne Negrin, who's currently the director of the Huichol Research Center, devoted their lives to Huichol
wow.
art and have a very
Okay.
important, so we have a gallery of yarn paintings on our site. And we also have some catalogs and some books, both for view and for sale. So,
Okay.
you know, down the line,
I
we
would
invite you to just visit that. And
I
with-
would love to see that.
yeah.
I would love to see that. I thank you for saying that. I'm an artist and I paint rock art here in Texas, and I try to interpret them. But a lot of them, they say, have a connection with Huichol. So I'm trying to see the connection, I guess. But you know, that's why I joined the group. I jumped in. But thank you for explaining that. Thank you.
That's wonderful. No, I think one of the things that we see is a lot of connections with the Southwest. So if you find out more, let us know. And with regards to the school, I did want to add that a lot of our students, I think, reflect what Jimena was saying in terms of the disparities in education. So some communities have been able to establish more solid schools, others less so. Some of our students have had to do their high school education in small towns. Others have been able to do their high school education in autonomous community high schools, which have had a bit of a more radical curriculum, a more decolonized curriculum, if you will. And so we
Okay.
see that represented in the students that we support, you know, kind of where they're coming from and how that reflects disparities.
There was another question by Mark saying, you know, to what extent do youth speak their indigenous language? And I mean, I would say, and maybe you can add to that, Diana, is that it also depends from which community they come, right? So there's communities, like when we look at the Huichol territory, there's communities that are more on the outskirts of that territory, and that the youth will speak more Spanish probably than the Huichol language. Whereas if you look at some of the communities that more are at the center of that territory, the percentage of people that speak Huichol among them as a first language will be higher, right? So it really depends. And some of the parents also have chosen to move to bigger towns, maybe to have more access to services. And so the kids also have been exposed to more Spanish. So I think there's a lot of variety. My sense is that Huichol language is still very much spoken, and because of its importance also in the music and in the rituals, I have a sense that it is still it's still very much present. But I think that the youth probably, like the youth everywhere in indigenous cultures, you know, they listen to music in English and Spanish. They're also very much part of a youth culture, which is not necessarily in an indigenous language, unfortunately. But maybe Diana, you can add to that.
I think that's a great answer. And there's a lot of revitalization. I think that's one of the exciting things. There's a lot of pushing that language not be lost in curriculum, that it be spoken in the cities. I've met students here in California who are of Wixarika descent, that's one of the first things they want to do is to learn their languages, their ancestral languages. So.
I have a question. There's a couple of really good surveys up in the Canadian area where they've asked Indigenous students in post-secondary, why did you go to post-secondary? And I think surveying roughly 2 generations apart, I think one was early 2000s, one was late 2000 and teens. The students, the majority said, I come to post-secondary so I can help my community and help my family, help the people around me. I always find that to be amazing, because the same survey is asked of mainstream students. It's, I want a good career, I want a good wage, whatever. Is there anything that shows, have the students ever been asked that? The Wixarika students, they ever been asked why they go?
Well, I think, yeah, go ahead. I think you've asked them in their, they have a survey, right? You guys have a survey.
Well, that was my PhD research was on that very topic, and there's a book, and you can check it out on our website that gets into the detail, right? What are some of the motivations? And I think you see exactly what you said, a lot of motivation to give back to the community. But I've had, heard students say, well, what if we just want to study because we want a good house ourselves, right? We don't want to have to worry about giving back. Why do we have this burden that the non-Indigenous students don't necessarily have? And that is something that's put up to debate. But I would say most of the students, and for sure when we get applications for the scholarship, that's one of the things that they really articulate, right? Is in what way do they see themselves and what careers they're studying being of service. So we have an architecture student right now, and she's from one of those communities that Jimena mentioned, that's had more of a cultural erasure. There's less speaking of the language, and she's studying architecture because she wants to kind of bring back traditional forms of architecture.
But it's what I wanted to add, it's interesting because I think, and I've seen that with the Indigenous students that I've had in Canada, there's a very strong sense of cultural identity. You know, when we think of like this, you know, in Mexico is also a mishmash, you know, there's kind of this mestizo identity where you're just like kind of Mexican, and but there's not a real sense of what are your roots, what is your land, who are your ancestors. And I think that the Huichol people that I met, you know, that sense of a lineage and of a belonging to a land, to a place, is very strong. And so the sense of who is your community and where is it? It's not vague, you know, it's a very specific place. And so to go back to that place, to be able to give back to that place has meaning, and it's a very personal meaning because there is that sense of identity and connection to that place. And so that's always something that I've also seen with my students here in Canada, whether it was Inuit students or Mohawk students, their sense of cultural identity is very strong. And so their sense of community and relationships within that community are very strong. So do we say that it's less individualized and more community oriented? You know, maybe we could put it in those terms, but I also see it like a cultural identity, a very strong sense of culture.
Encouraging. Yeah.
Maybe I can just add a small point. It's true that we do survey the recipients of our scholarship fund each year to ask them about their experience and their motivations and so on. But it is also worth pointing out that in the selection process, we weigh when looking at the applications, we weigh the applications that indicate students have been involved previously in their community more strongly than those who don't. So we are trying quite consciously to ensure that the scholarship fund deliberately adds to the capacity of the community to defend itself and to ensure that the kinds of skills and expertise that it needs is available to them, to it. So I think that's an important thing to know about the work that we're doing with the scholarship fund.
Yeah, and Yvonne was adding that the Wixarika are raised in a culture that values service, and I saw that every time. You know, I saw that every time that I went to the Sierra, and how the young people, everybody's included. It's not a chore. You know, it becomes part of what you do, right? It becomes part of the pedagogy, the education, and it's part of a larger view. You know, there's also the sense that, you know, you give back also to the earth, you give back to the elements, you give back everything. There's a cycle, right? If there's a spring that gives you water, well, you give an offering to that spring because that spring is giving you something. It's not taken for granted. You know, there's always, and the rains, when the rains come, there's a sense of the cycle, right? So you have to give back. It's a less greedy culture. Like, I mean, I see that also in those terms. So Flor was commenting that you did not know about Semana Santa being celebrated in Wixarika culture. So it's Catholic influences in these communities. So as I was saying, it's an interesting type of influence because it's been added to. It has not replaced. And this is really a different perspective. You know, when the Wixarika talk about, you know, Christ is associated with cattle, with money. It's associated with these things that came after at a certain time, but it was never seen as replacing anything. So that's kind of their strength, their ability to incorporate and indigenize these figures. So there's a sense of appropriation, you know, and for me, it was always fascinating to say how this culture was able to absorb to a certain degree these Catholic influences without losing its identity, without losing its core, right? And this is really the difficulty of a lot of Indigenous communities in North America, is that when missionaries came and told them, you know, whatever you're worshiping is, you know, is a Satan, you have to throw it away. They were traumatized, you know, a lot was lost, a lot of the chants, a lot of the songs, a lot of the rituals were lost. And it's not true for the Wixarika because those rituals are still very much alive and are still very much done. So Catholicism was able to, I mean, try to have that also, that very strong influence, and yet there is a core of resistance. And that's really the cultural resistance, the sense of, you know, what we have is valuable, it's worth, it's very valuable. Our tradition, our language, our myths, our songs are something that we should fight for. And they do, they really do fight for them. And it's very, they have a dignity and a strength. That's why I say, you know, they burned down some churches and some missions and said, you know, our temples are just as good as your temples and your missions. Why should our temples be burned down? In the name of what, you know?
Thank you. I just put in the chat, just curious where people, it seems like we've got a really nice crowd from across geographies.
You can also say how many inches of snow you have. I've got about
0.
15.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jimena, for such a wonderful presentation. Where's Ken?
Hi, how are you? I'm in Vermont. So
Not very far.
no. I just want to say the reason I'm here partly is I had an ancestor who was an actual colonizer in Mexico, in Tampico. He was actually part of the American colony there. And during the Mexican Revolution, they well, he ended up leaving. So I've just always been fascinated by, and I spent 20 years in California, in the Bay Area. And so I was always exposed to a lot of Latino Indigenous awareness. There was Casa Zapata. I went to Stanford, and there was Casa Zapata, and what was it, Culture Clash? Anyway, so I was always very, you know, and so I did, but I didn't know this family history of mine. And then I got into the family history, and then I was like, and so I just became very interested in the Indigenous perspective. Sorry about that. So I have dogs. So anyway, that's just a little bit of the prism I'm looking at it through. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Oh, New Mexico. I love New Mexico. So thank you for joining also from New Mexico. It's just as a parenthesis, you know, the Pueblo people of the Southwest, when I visited some of the Pueblos there, it reminded me a lot of the Huichol because, you know, they had the rebellion in 1680, also against the Spanish, and they created a whole community, like really a connection among all the Pueblos, and they have also a lot of that cultural resistance. So it's interesting how you find sometimes these similarities. And I think it's also very connected to not being removed from your land. Like when we look at the Cherokee that were removed to Oklahoma, when we look at a lot of these Eastern tribes that were forcibly removed, that had a very traumatic impact. But some of the peoples that remained on their ancestral territory in their homeland, even if it's shrunken, that sense of place and of groundedness and of rootedness is very strong still. So I love New Mexico. So hello to New Mexico.
So do we have any other questions or comments from folks?
Thank you. Just to add, those of you who, you know, please, hopefully you can join us listening to our next great presentation by Manuel in February. If not, you can visit the Wixarika research website, and there we have begun to add some of the student profiles. So if you want to get to know some of the students who have been a part of the program, that's a great place to also just keep connected to this project.